Here are some facts about me. I didn't even come to my father's funeral. My wife was crazy, and that is no exaggeration. 3 of my 4 children died. Depression almost killed me. All facts are truth. Hello, I am Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States, best known for leading the country through the Civil War and working to end slavery. I am ashamed of some things, and some things almost destroyed me. However, it is an integral part of my life. It proves that famous people have the same problems and life challenges as everyone else. Now all about it in more detail. I didn't even come to my father's funeral. Ah, how the weight of a father's hand can shape a man, for good or ill. A father can be a sculptor, molding the clay of his son's character with firm hands. Or he can be a blacksmith, hammering the metal of a boy's spirit into shape, sometimes leaving cracks that never truly heal. My father, Thomas Lincoln, was a man of the soil, born into the rhythms of the earth, a carpenter by trade and a firm believer in the virtue of toil. For him, labor was not merely a necessity but a creed, a philosophy that defined a man's worth. He valued the kind of strength that could drive a plow through unyielding soil, or raise a roof beam high into the sky. Calloused hands and a sturdy back were, in his eyes, the marks of a man fulfilled. But in me, he found a son who was crafted from a different mold, a boy whose strength lay not in his muscles but in his mind and his pen. This divergence set the stage for a lifelong conflict, a quiet but persistent battle between 2 opposing visions of what it meant to be a man. My father saw books as a distraction, a betrayal of the honest, tangible work of the hands. He could not fathom why I would spend countless hours hunched over borrowed pages, squinting at words by the dim, flickering light of a candle. To him, this was idleness, a frivolous indulgence that led nowhere good. To me, it was nothing short of salvation, an escape from the narrow confines of a life predetermined. He was a strict man, often to the point of harshness, and his voice could cut deeper than the sharpest blade. His discipline was a forge, and pain was his hammer. He believed that character was tempered through hardship, and I bore the evidence of his beliefs in the scars etched onto both my flesh and my spirit. Yet, even as I feared him, I could not help but study him. He was a man caught between worlds, tied to the traditions of his fathers yet battling to survive in a rapidly changing world. I do not believe he ever intended to be cruel, but intention and impact do not always align. I will not say I hated him, for hate is too heavy a burden to bear for long. Yet I cannot deny the chasm that grew between us. He wanted a laborer and found a dreamer. I wanted understanding and found a tyrant. Perhaps we both saw shadows where there were none. He, desperate to shape the world in his image, could not see that my resistance was not rebellion but a plea for recognition. I, desperate for freedom, could not see that his rigidity was born of fear, a fear that the world would crush a boy who dared to dream too far beyond his station. When he fell ill, I was far away, building a life on my own terms, far from the fields and traditions of my upbringing. The news of his passing reached me, and though I felt a deep stirring of something, grief, perhaps, or guilt, I did not return. Perhaps it was resentment that kept me away, a wound too raw to be confronted. Or perhaps it was fear that I would stand over his grave and find nothing to say, no words that could bridge the distance that had grown between us. What could I have said to the earth that now held him? Forgiveness? Gratitude? I was not ready for either, and so I stayed away, choosing silence over confrontation. And yet, in the quiet hours of the night, when the world is still and the mind is free to wander, I find myself haunted by questions that have no answers. Did he ever truly see me, not as I failed to be, but as I was? Did he ever feel pride in the boy who turned his back on the fields and the ways of his ancestors, seeking instead a life of the mind? These questions linger like ghosts, whispering in the corners of my thoughts, and their weight is a heavy one to carry. If I have borne his disapproval like a chain, it is because I never learned how to set it down. It has followed me through every triumph and every failure, a shadow cast by a man whose presence loomed large even in his absence. And if I walk this world estranged from the memory of my father, it is not without sorrow, for the echoes of our origins never truly leave us. A man's heart, no matter how free it may seem, is always tethered to the roots from which it grew. Sometimes I imagine another life, a parallel existence where he and I could stand as equals, not as adversaries. I see us sitting side by side, the distance between us bridged not by words but by a quiet understanding, a shared recognition of the different strengths we each possess. In that life, perhaps he would see that the pen and the plow are not so different after all, that both carve paths through the world, leaving marks that endure. But here, in this life, the bond between us was broken before it had a chance to bend, and I am left with nothing but wonder for what might have been. Regret is a peculiar thing, a weight that grows heavier with time yet never seems to reach a conclusion. I carry it with me, not as a punishment but as a reminder of the man who shaped me, for better or worse, and the lessons I learned in his shadow. Perhaps, in the end, that is all any of us can do, carry the echoes of those who came before us and try, in our own imperfect ways, to make sense of them. For though he is gone, his voice lingers still, a quiet murmur in the recesses of my mind, urging me onward, shaping me still. My wife was crazy, and that is no exaggeration. Ah, my dear Mary! How the world misunderstands her, judges her, even mocks her. Yet, who among us carries a sorrow so heavy as hers, or bears it so bravely? My life with Mary has been a tempest, yes, but one with flashes of light and warmth that even the fiercest storm cannot extinguish. I met her in Springfield, Illinois, in 1839, during a time when I was still finding my footing as a young lawyer. Mary Todd, the daughter of a wealthy Kentucky family, stood out in every way imaginable. She was highly educated, speaking fluent French and possessing a keen interest in politics, a rarity among women of her time. People often described her as ambitious and outspoken, qualities that were both admired and criticized. For me, those very traits set her apart. She was sharp as a blade, quick-witted, and full of a passion for life that both captivated and intimidated me. We married in 1842, despite differences in our backgrounds and the doubts of those around us. Mary had grown up in privilege, while I had known only poverty. She was accustomed to refinement, while I was often described as rough around the edges. And yet, despite these contrasts, or perhaps because of them, we found a kind of balance, at least in those early years. Mary was always a woman of deep feeling. Too deep, perhaps, for a world as hard and unyielding as ours. When we began our family, her joys and sorrows became intertwined with the lives of our children. Our home was blessed with 4 sons, Robert, Edward, William, Willie, and Thomas Tad. Yet joy was often shadowed by tragedy. Eddie, our second son, died in 1850 at just 4 years old, likely of tuberculosis. Mary was devastated, as was I, but her grief ran to depths I could scarcely comprehend. The death of Willie in 1862 during my presidency shattered her further. Willie was a bright, cheerful boy, beloved by all who knew him, and his death from typhoid fever left an emptiness in our home that could never be filled. Mary mourned him with an intensity that frightened even those closest to her. She would sit in his room for hours, refusing to leave, clinging to his belongings as though they could bring him back. I grieved too, but my role as president demanded composure. Her grief, raw and unrestrained, became another point of tension between us. And the public, they are merciless, are they not? Mary's coping mechanisms often drew harsh criticism. Her penchant for fine clothing and extravagant White House renovations during a time of war was seen as selfish and unpatriotic. What they failed to see was her longing to create some semblance of beauty in a life marred by loss and chaos. To her, the silks and jewels were not frivolities but a way to assert dignity in the face of overwhelming sorrow. Her temper and mood swings became a source of gossip in Washington society. She was accused of meddling in politics, of being difficult to work with, even of being disloyal. Every word of criticism seemed to wound her more deeply. They did not see the heart behind her actions, the woman trying to navigate a world that was often unkind to women who refused to conform. It was not easy for me. Her grief, her accusations, her fears, they often clashed with the immense pressures of leading a nation through civil war. There were moments when her anger turned toward me, and I, overwhelmed by the weight of my own responsibilities, struggled to provide the support she needed. I do not pretend to have been the perfect husband. My focus on the war and the future of the Union left little room for the personal battles she was fighting. Perhaps it is my own guilt that weighs heaviest of all. Could I have done more? Should I have shielded her better from the scrutiny of the public, held her closer during her darkest moments? I often wonder if my silence in those times of conflict contributed to her feelings of isolation. After my assassination in 1865, Mary's life spiraled further into despair. She was left a widow in a world that had little sympathy for her. The loss of Tad in 1871 only deepened her suffering. Her erratic behavior and frequent spending sprees led to public accusations of insanity. Even her eldest son, Robert, felt compelled to have her institutionalized in 1875, a decision that strained their relationship for the rest of her life. Mary was not perfect, but who among us is? She loved deeply and felt fiercely, and in her way, she bore as much of the burden of this turbulent age as any soldier who fell upon the field of battle. She was a mother who loved her children with a devotion that knew no bounds, a wife who supported her husband despite immense personal struggles, and a woman who faced the relentless scrutiny of a nation with as much grace as she could muster. When I think of her now, I think not of her faults but of her resilience. She endured losses that would have broken many, yet she continued to fight for her dignity and her place in a world that often sought to erase her. Though the world may remember her flaws, I shall remember her as she was, a woman of courage, passion, and sorrow too deep for words. 3 of my 4 children died. Ah, the loss of a child! Words fail me, though I have long been a man of words. To bury a son, to place him in the cold, unyielding earth, while his laughter still lingers in your ears, it is a wound no time can heal, a sorrow no mortal should endure. And yet, endure it I have, again and again. My dear Edward, my bright-eyed boy, you were but a tender bloom when fate took you from us. Barely 4 years old, your laughter filled our humble home like sunshine breaking through the clouds. And then came the fever, relentless and cruel. I sat by your side, helpless, watching as the light faded from your eyes. I held you, my boy, as you took your final breath. It was as though the heavens themselves had dimmed. Years passed, and the ache softened, though it never disappeared. Then came Willie, my precious, sweet Willie, so full of life, so wise beyond his years. He was the heart of our family, the one who brought laughter to the solemn halls of the White House, even as the weight of war bore down upon me. But war spares nothing, not even the innocent. When Willie fell ill, I prayed as I had never prayed before. Surely, I thought, surely God would not take another son from me. But my prayers went unanswered. As I watched him slip away, I felt the very ground beneath me crumble. When he passed, it was as if a part of my soul had been buried with him. Mary. Oh, Mary suffered terribly. Her grief consumed her, and there were times when I feared she might not return from the depths of her sorrow. But I, too, was drowning, though I could not show it. A nation torn asunder demanded my strength, my resolve. How could I weep openly when so many fathers and mothers were burying their own sons, lost to the horrors of battle? Yet, in the quiet moments, in the stillness of the night, when the burdens of the presidency faded, I allowed myself to remember. I would sit alone and think of Edward's laughter, of Willie's bright eyes. I would close my eyes and imagine their hands in mine, their voices calling, "Father!" Some say a man cannot grieve and lead at the same time. Perhaps they are right. But I believe it was my grief that gave me strength. For if I, a father broken by loss, could still stand, still fight for what was just and true, then perhaps this fractured nation could heal as well. My sons are gone, but their memory remains, a bittersweet ache in my heart. I see them in every young soldier who marches to war, in every child who laughs freely, unburdened by the world's sorrows. They are not here, yet they are everywhere. And when my time comes, when I too must cross that great divide, I hope to see them again, to hold them close and tell them how their father carried on, even when his heart was shattered. Until that day, I carry their memory with me, a light in the darkness, a reminder of love and loss, and the fragile beauty of this fleeting life. Depression almost killed me. Ah, how the heart, so prone to doubt and fear, can lead a man to folly. How it can wage war with the mind and send even the steadiest of souls spiraling into confusion. Of all my trials, and they have been many, the breaking of my engagement to Mary Todd was one of the most anguished chapters of my life. You see, I am not a man made for love's easy grace. I have long been a creature of thought, of books, of quiet reflection. Matters of the heart? They confuse me, terrify me even. And yet, there was Mary, with her sharp wit, her fire, her unyielding spirit. She could match me, word for word, thought for thought. And in her company, I found myself both drawn and afraid, as though I had discovered some great and untamed force of nature. We were to marry, she and I. The banns were read, the dates set, the future laid before us like an open road. And yet, as the day approached, my mind became a battlefield. Questions swarmed like bees in a hive. Am I good enough for her? Could I provide for her the life she deserved? Would my restless nature doom us both to unhappiness? These doubts grew louder, drowning out reason, and on that dark day in 1841, I broke our engagement. I withdrew, not with courage but with cowardice, unable to face her or even myself. I know not what hurt more, her wounded eyes, or the knowledge that I had put that pain there myself. In the days that followed, I was a man adrift. I took to my bed, consumed by a darkness I could not name. The most miserable period of my life. I later called it, and I spoke true. Friends feared for my sanity, and I confess so did I. To have hurt Mary, to have cast aside something so rare and beautiful, felt an unforgivable sin. And yet time, as it often does, worked its quiet magic. Slowly, painfully, I began to find my footing again. I returned to the law, to my books, to my work. But Mary never left my thoughts. By some miracle, her forgiveness, her patience, her belief in me that I scarcely deserved, we found our way back to one another. And though our marriage was not without its storms, I have often thought of how close I came to losing her forever, and how that loss might have shaped me into a different man, a lesser man. Even now, I wrestle with the memory of that dark time. Perhaps it was a test, a reckoning of sorts, to measure the depth of my heart and the steel of my resolve. If so, I pray I emerge stronger, though the scars remain. From this, I have learned that love is no simple matter. It is not always soft, nor always kind. It can wound as surely as it can heal. But it is worth the pain, worth the risk, for in its crucible we are made whole. So let my misstep, my folly, serve as a lesson to others. Do not let fear guide your heart. For love, though fraught with uncertainty, is the greatest force we mortals can know. And when it is true, as I believe it was with Mary, it can endure even our greatest failings.